In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a provisional cast on. Now, there are several provisional cast ons. My favorite is the Invisible cast on. And to do that, you need your yarn you're going to be knitting with, a spare waste yarn, and a knitting needle. This cast on isn't necessarily suitable if you're casting on a lot of stitches. And you'll see why once I get started. I still use it when I'm casting on a lot of stitches as well though, because I don't like the other alternative provisional cast-ons. What you're going to do, you're going to take your main yarn, make a slip knot. So to make a slip knot, just make a loop, and I've just made it, made a loop, and the top yarn is crossing over like that. Then I put my fingers through and I just pull the end through. So a slip knot is just a loop that you can adjust and pull out. We're not actually going to use the slip knot in our cast on. We are going to remove that at the end, so that's why it's important that you can undo it. So you need a piece of waste yarn. I've got one that's attached to the ball. You can just have a length of waste yarn. It has to be longer than your cast on edge. Now I'm going to use a circular needle, but if you're going to cast on more stitches than will fit on your needle tip, then I do recommend you use a straight needle for casting on, because the stitches, once they get onto the cable, they'll start untwisting. So a straight needle is better if you're casting on a lot of stitches. So what I've done is I put a slip knot on my needle, I put the end of the waste yarn through it, and then I've tightened the slip knot. So the waste yarn is basically sort of parallel to my knitting needle. Then I'm taking the tails of the slip yarn and my working yarn. Make sure the tail of the slip yarn is long enough so you don't accidentally pull it through the slip knot. Holding that in my right hand with my knitting needle. Now you don't need to hold anything in your left hand except for your yarn. So just hold knitting needle in your right hand, sorry, and just let the other end of the circular needle drop if you're using a circular needle. And then you're going to hold it similar to a long tail cast on. So you're going to take the waste yarn. So you're going to take the working yarn over your index finger, the waste yarn over your thumb, like that. Then I just put the tails and tighten and hold up with my other fingers. It's not exactly the same as the long tail cast on, it's just held similar. So you're going to hold the working yarn over your index finger, waste yarn over your thumb, and then tails and your knitting needle in your right hand. So you're going to take the needle away from you and over and under the working yarn, then towards you and under the waste yarn, and then away from you, over and under the working yarn, and then back straight under the waste yarn and back up to the starting position. So now you've got your slip knot and 2 stitches. So each time you do this cast on, you cast on 2 stitches. So your cast on will be in groups of 2 stitches. And I'll tell you what to do at the end if you have an odd number. So let's go through that again. Take your needle away from you, around the working yarn, up in the middle, towards you and under the waste yarn, up in the middle, up and over the working yarn, and then back under the waste yarn and up to the starting position. You've now got 2 more stitches. Now every time you cast on a pair of stitches, your waste yarn should be crossing in front of your working yarn here and your needle. Now I tend to hold on to these stitches as I cast on so they don't start twisting around my needle, because all I do is winding the yarn around my needle. When I've finished my pair, when I've cast on 1 pair of stitches, I should only have the working yarn over my needle. The waste yarn weaves in and out of the stitches underneath the needle here. So let's go through that again. So away and over the working yarn, so over and under the working yarn, towards me, under the waste yarn, up and over the working yarn, oops, and then back under the waste yarn and up in the middle. It is kind of like a figure 8 movement, so over, up in the middle, over, up in the middle, over, and then under. So over, 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 under, over, 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 under. So if you need to see that more times, just watch the video from the beginning again. So your stitches will look like they're really tight, but they're not. When you start knitting, they'll actually feel really, really loose. So don't worry about them feeling tight. If you don't hold your stitches under your hand, they will start twisting around the needle and you will gradually lose them. That's because they're not secure till you've worked the first row. That's why I tend to keep my hand over the stitches that I've cast on and keep them bunched up, which is why this cast on isn't necessarily suitable if you're casting on a lot of stitches. I'm talking like in excess of 50 stitches probably, although I have used it for over 100 stitches because this is the only provisional cast on that I really like using. So once you finish casting on, make sure that you finish where the waist yarn is crossing in front of your working yarn. Now if you need to cast on an odd number of stitches, because with this cast on you'll end up with an even number of stitches because you're not counting the slip knot. So if you want an odd number of stitches, cast on more stitches than you need. So if I need 19 stitches, I'll cast on 20, and then on row 1 I'll just knit 19. Because it's quite hard if you cast on a lot of stitches, it is quite hard to count them afterwards, to go back and count them, because you've got to try and hold on to them and you can't let go of this because then this unravels. And so it's better if you cast on too many stitches. Doesn't matter if you cast on too many stitches. There are things that we can do. Oops, I just nearly knocked my camera over. So if you cast on too many stitches, we can just drop the remaining stitches at the end. So it's better to cast on too many stitches than too few stitches. So once you finish your cast on, you knit your needles. When you finish your cast on, obviously nothing is secure till you work the first row. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So what I do is I pinch it here, and then I transfer the needle into my left hand, still pinching, and then I grab my other needle, and then make sure that when you start knitting, that the working yarn is crossing in front of the waist yarn here, and then I go in and I knit. So if you knit the English way with the yarn in your right hand, just be careful that you don't allow this to become untwisted, because you will then lose the stitch. So I then knit the number of stitches I need for my cast on. And if I've cast on too many stitches, I just knit the number of stitches I need, and then I just let the rest drop off my needle. And if I've cast on the right number of stitches, then I just knit till I get to the last stitch, get to my slip knot, take the slip knot off. Now you will see that your tail is still threaded through the slip knot. I tend to leave it there for a while, because if I undo it now, can you see here how this isn't looking very secure? So the only thing that's kind of keeping that from unraveling at the moment is the fact that the yarn goes through my slip knot. If I pull that tail out, then this will become very insecure. So I tend to just leave it there till I've done a few rows. So with this cast on, you always start with a setup row. So if your pattern starts with a knit row, with a right side row, you would do a wrong side row first. So if the first right side row was knit to end, I would start with a purl row. If I'm working stocking stitch, I'd start with a purl row. If I'm doing garter stitch, I'll start with a knit row. Just with a plain wrong side row, whatever that is in your pattern. Don't do any lace stitches or anything like that on the first row. Now, when you do a provisional cast on, quite often you will be asked to cast on one stitch more than what's required, and then knit two together somewhere in the middle of the first row. The reason for this is that when you pick up, if you see here, I don't know how you see it's going to be to see, but you can see the stitches on my needle, then you can see these loops, like the waist yarn goes through. That's actually the loops between the stitches that are on my needle. So you will end up with one stitch less, except with this cast on one end, there's like a little extra loop that you can use. So if I need 20 stitches, I can cast on 20 stitches, and I can still end up with 20 loops when I pick up the provisional cast on. But normally if I wanted 20 stitches, I would cast on 21 and then knit or purl 2 together in the middle of the first row. So the best thing is probably to do what the pattern says. And when you pick up the stitches from the waste yarn later on, to do whatever it is you're doing to them, which is usually to knit an edging or something into them, then just have a look at the pattern and do what it says. Make sure you end up with the correct number of stitches that you need for your pattern. Okay, so what I do once I have knitted a few rows, then I tend to take the tail out of the slip knot, and then I can undo my slip knot, and then I always tie the ends together, especially if they're gonna be on my needles for a while, so I don't accidentally pull one out. So you can see now I've taken the slip knot, the waist yarn out of the slip knot. Can you see how this is kind of unraveling? I'm having awful problems with light today. It's because the sun keeps coming and going. Is that better? So you can see how this has now come undone. That's why it's best to work a few rows before you pull the waist yarn out of the slip knot. Okay, so if you have any questions, just ask and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you for watching.